And again, my name's Mike Miller. I'm Supervisor of Environmental Services with the Peoria Park District and have been a member of Peoria Audubon for, many years. I've worked for the Park District for over 30 years and I probably have been involved with Audubon that many years as well. And so it's great to see everyone after kind of 7 months of not having meetings. It's nice to at least have the virtual meetings and see some of the familiar names and familiar faces. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen to do the program. So I will pull this up and we will get started. So, if at any time during the presentation, Dennis, if you can keep an eye on either the chat window or the I really can't see everybody from my perspective. I just have a few people that I can see. So if you can kind of keep an eye on that, that will.
Yes. It goes without saying, but as you're speaking, Mike, I will be monitoring the waiting room if any additional guests show up, and I'll admit them. And
okay.
So the meeting is now yours, Mike. I'll turn it over to you, but I will handle all logistics as they develop.
Okay. So so I'd like to kind of start this discussion off. I'm going to cause the Audubon Society to stretch beyond birds for a minute, because the whole impetus behind our program, our habitat grant, was not necessarily for the birds, but for the bugs. and in particular, this little fella is a bumblebee, and we'll talk a little bit about these native bees and some of the challenges that they're facing and why bee habitat has become important to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So here in the Midwest, we have approximately 400 to 500 species of native bees, and they're often, they have been poorly studied, all of our native bees. Sometimes people say they're a little difficult to identify, but a bumblebee is a bumblebee. They kind of all look similar, but once you get to know them, just like confusing fall warblers, you can identify them pretty easily. And most of the research that's done on bees, if you read articles in the paper, or if you ask somebody, about bees and the importance of them, most people do think of the honeybee. And like I say, majority of research is done on honeybees, which are an important pollinator for several food crops. What often doesn't get recognized, though, is how important the native bees in combination with the honeybees are for native food production. About only 4% of research dollars that are out there in the insect world are getting spent on bumblebees. And then just a very small percentage is getting spent on other bees. So we're kind of at a point, either fortunately or unfortunately, where native bees are getting their day in the sun, so to speak. And the unfortunate reason why is because we're seeing declines in their population. But we are getting a little bit more aware of the plight of native bees. And let's see here. I have to figure how to advance my screen. I guess right there. So when we look at native bees, one of the things to consider is how they live their life, how their reproduction takes place. That's one way that we differentiate native bees. About 10% of native bees are what we call colonial. They build a hive or have a hive structure. You know, the bumblebees are an example of a colonial bee. You'll have a queen, you'll have workers, you'll have drones, um, and you know, so that is a colonial type of a natural history or a reproductive strategy. Another, and a majority of bees are solitary bees. You know, they are leafcutter bees or flower cutting bees. They will, orchard mason bees are an example of this. These are bees that don't necessarily build a colonial hive. They don't necessarily have a queen. Each individual female lays eggs, and they tend to, you know, lay their eggs. A lot of the bees that you would find nesting within the hollow pith of a plant, or would be these types. The orchard mason bee probably being the one that people are most common with, because the orchard mason bee is an easy one to get to use artificial structures. These solitary bees are really good pollinators. They visit lots of flowers and carry lots of pollen. So 75% of bees kind of fall into this reproductive strategy. And finally, there's about 15% of bees that are what we call kleptoparasitic. That means that they tend to lay their eggs on another living individual, a caterpillar or something along those lines, or some type of other insect. Bees have a very diverse strategy for a reproduction. And so what we're going to focus on a little bit is kind of the life history of the colonial strategists, particularly the bumblebees. So one of these bumblebees, which was once very common in Illinois, and it was probably for all of us in the room who are over a certain age, if you remember going out into your lawn as a child and seeing bumblebees on a patch of clover growing in your lawn, chances are it was a rusty-patched bumblebee. Was one of the more common bees in the eastern United States and the Midwest. Now it's an endangered species. It's the first bee to become an endangered species. So what does that mean for us? First of all, just kind of it's Bombus affinis is the Latin name for the rusty-patched bumblebee. They get their name from a little rusty patch that's on the backside of their body. It's not as visible on this. This is actually a rusty-patched bumblebee that we observed in one of our parks in a collection jar. So I've got some more pictures of them later. But the rusty-patched bumblebee was first listed on January of 2017, and like I said, it was a relatively common bee in 28 states and 2 Canadian provinces. And basically, since 1990, we've seen about a 90% reduction across its range. And today, only scattered populations of this bee remain. On this map, you can kind of see the area in light green is the former range of the rusty-patched bumblebee. The areas in yellow are possible populations of them, and the areas in red are known populations of them. So what once was from Maine all the way to the Dakotas and south into Georgia, its range has severely restricted, and just a few remnant populations of them left. If we kind of focus in a little bit on Illinois, you can see kind of around the collar counties of the Chicago region, a population there. And here is Peoria County. And you can see we have about a half dozen known populations of them here in Peoria County. And so this is the extent of the range of this insect in Illinois. So Peoria is kind of an important spot, since we know we have populations of them here, and that we can, and really, you know, between us and Chicago, there's very little activity, you know, with rusty patch bumblebee, and so we're kind of an important holdout for the population of Illinois, and especially South Central Illinois. So here again, you can see, well, before we discuss why they've become endangered, if you look at these pictures, you can kind of see that little rusty patch that's on the backs. It's on the yellow band on the abdomen. There's actually two yellow segments, and the rusty patch is actually within the yellow segment. You can actually see a little yellow between the black band and the rusty patch. There is another bee that is kind of similar to this, Bombus grisicollis, or it's called the brown-belted bee. You would not notice any yellow between the black patch and the brown patch. The black and brown go together on the brown-belted bumblebee. So why have these things become endangered? Good question. Science really doesn't have a firm answer, but we have some theories. And remember I said that it's around 1990 we started to see huge decline in these bees and the bee numbers in the population. And part of that, if we look at what other environmental factors have been going on in that time, we can kind of look at habitat and look at other outside forces. This is Iowa, which is in their range. Iowa and Illinois are kind of similar. Iowa's got some good statistics on some of their habitat changes in the state of Iowa. So this is showing the acres of grassland, wetlands, and shrublands between the differences in, I gotta try to move something here so I can see. I just need to move my screen so I could see. Okay, so this is between 2008 and 2011. And the areas in this darker color are all areas that are formerly habitat with the rusty patch bumblebee, where over 30,000 acres of these grasslands, wetlands, and shrublands have been converted into agriculture in that time period from 2008 to 2011. So you can see most of these habitats that are important for this species of bee have been altered. So we're still altering habitats. If you think we can't alter things any more than we have, we're still doing it. You know, it's in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. You know, agriculture is still king. The other thing that's going on is, and this is with the introduction of some different pesticides. This is a neonicotinoid pesticide, and how its use has increased in this case since about 2000, when these neonics were introduced. The thing with these pesticides is we have a feeling that they do, especially if tend to affect colonial pollinators or colonial insects, in that they can get concentrated within a hive culture. And so this is a pesticide of concern. Many countries have outlawed the pesticide. Most of the research that has been done with this have been done with honeybees, and not necessarily bumblebees. So we're starting to look at using funding now to. We've got a pretty good idea of how they can affect the honeybee population. We're starting to infer how that affects the bumblebee population as well. So this is a new thing on the playing field for these bees that they're having to deal with. Also, just the use of glyphosate, which is not a insecticide, but it's actually a herbicide. Its increase in use in the agricultural community, it's become a kind of the dominant crop. Especially Roundup Ready corn and soybeans are pretty much ubiquitous throughout the Midwest and the plains. It's used quite heavily. And while this is not necessarily a insecticide, there's some indication that it can weaken the health of colonizing hive nesters, but it also has kind of an effect on especially ephemeral plants that might have gotten a start out in farm fields, early in the spring, are often eliminated by the use of this chemical early. So it could affect the ability for bees to find pollen and forage early in the spring. So these are all things that we see. It's all something that the bees are having to deal with on an annual basis. So, and if you look back before in the early 1990s is really when Roundup Ready agriculture kind of took off. And today, we're putting about 250 million pounds of just this chemical in the environment on a annual basis. And this is in 2011. So, even this data is a little behind the times. Again, neonicotinoid usage in Iowa. Sorry for the pixelated graphic here, but you can see from 2003 to 2014, a 10-year period, the amount, kilograms per year has really gone up. So, okay, so well, let's step back for a minute and look at the habitat of these bumblebees, and this graphic kind of shows, the life cycle and a year-round basis, starting here in April, when overwintering queens that have been produced the year before have overwintered and are below ground. or under logs as a nesting site. They start to forage for pollen and nectar, and those queens that have overwintered, are fertile when they are fertilized before fall, and they basically will emerge. They'll start to produce a small hive. They'll produce a few workers. That initial brood emerges. They tend to be worker bees. They do foraging. The queen will now stay in the nest where her sole duty is to lay eggs. Early in the year, when the Virginia bluebells are blooming, you can see queens of lots of different bumblebees coming to, those spring ephemeral flowers. And so, and the queens are much larger than the workers. And so you'll see those big bumblebees early in the spring when those spring ephemerals are coming out. Once the hive is established, and they have, the bumblebees have all been out active, pulling pollen. And here's a little difference between a bumblebee and a honeybee. The bumblebees tend to be protein eaters. They are visiting the flowers. They'll drink nectar, but they're visiting the flowers for protein. They are collecting pollen, and they have the pollen combs on their legs. They bring lots of pollen back. They tend to feed their young, the brood, this pollen.
Hey, David.
And along about late summer, the colony switches from producing worker bees in this process to producing new queens and males. They're the reproductive members of the colony, and after mating, the males die, and then the new queens will start to search for a place to overwinter. And so basically, the queens fly off. They'll find a place to overwinter, usually below the soil surface, and the rest of the hive basically dies off. And so it's the workers and the drones and anybody who's not a queen really does not survive this. So you can kind of see the life cycle here of the queens, overwintering, coming into play in March, April, actively breeding through October, and then new queens will be produced. So this is kind of the life cycle of this bee. Honeybees are much different in that the hive tends to survive over winter. That's what makes honeybees easier to transport, and because they do have a perennial life cycle. And so that's why, people usually don't rear bumblebees to take to almond orchards to kind of, that's why European honeybees are used for that. They're a little easier to work with. So here's where we get into habitat. Now that you know the ecology behind this bee, here's where we kind of get into what these bees need to survive. And that's where the funding that we have received through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is helping through the nesting habitat and the foraging habitat for this particular, for the rusty patch bumblebee in particular, but also other species of associated insects. So basically, their nesting habitat, they're looking to nest between 1 to 3 feet below ground in open areas. Tends to be warm season grasses. Native bunch grasses are ideal. So prairie grasses, little blue stem, big blue stem, interspersed with foraging, nectar producing and pollen producing crops, of plants. they like areas of uncompacted soil. So areas with no or low intensity grazing, infrequent mowings, and infrequent burns at a rate, you know, that does allow for some overwintering habitat to evolve, you know, and not intense burns, especially things that would burn below the ground. So their foraging habitat, which is, you know, needed March through October. These plantings should have, you know, 10 plus flowering plants blooming throughout the spring, summer, and fall. And bumblebees are pretty particular about what types of flowers they're attracted to. They tend not to be attracted too much to non-native plants. Again, these are not plants that they have evolved with, and so they really don't use them. So they're really focused on native species, and not only because of familiarity, but because some of these native plants are what we call superfoods and immune building plants. So the superfoods being like wild bergamot and prairie clover, hyssop, goldenrod, asters, lead plant, Joe Pye weed, and coneflowers. Those are good pollen and nectar producers. Some of the immune building plants, bergamot, sunflowers, turtlehead, the penstemons. We don't really have a lot of wild blueberry or wild cranberry here. That's more of a northern, in the northern range. But if you're looking to plant foods, there's a lot of information online. And if you go online, this is going to be way too small and too wordy for you to read on the screen. But if you just look up Rusty Patch Bumblebee Midwest Plant Guide, you will find this. Actually, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a full website devoted to Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and this basically came from that. So it kind of tells you what plants that you can find, not only for the Midwest, but for the Great Plains in the Northeast, throughout the range, which are considered, you know, which herbaceous species are good for them, both as and kind of with what kind of habitat that these plants will grow in as well. So this guide is available online. And again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has some great information on Rusty Patch Bumblebee and what to plant. So in particular, I mentioned Rusty Patch Bumblebee. Some of the other things that are also kind of assisted by this grant are, of course, the Monarch Butterfly and a species of plant. In one of the areas we're working, the Decurrent False Aster is a federally threatened species of plant. It grows in about 11 counties up and down the Illinois River, and that's about it. And so one of our sites in particular is a very good habitat for the Decurrent False Asters. So those are the three kind of keystone species that our projects are working to improve habitat for. And the first one is one that a lot of you might be familiar with, Donovan Park. It's a former golf course. Here we're going to restore 12.5 acres, which is currently in a no-mow area, into you know, a prairie habitat. And so if you're familiar with Donovan Park, this is Knoxville that basically goes along here, and Northmore Road is up here. So kind of this triangle, if you come into Donovan Park, the old clubhouse, Sid's Restaurant is right here. So you can sit at Sid's Restaurant and overlook to the northeast this habitat here. One reason that this is kind of as attractive is because just right across Knoxville and Prospect, you have Forest Park Nature Center in this region, which is good woodland, good overwintering habitat for them. But the rusty patch bumblebee should do well in this site. We have seen rusty patch bumblebee in this region of Peoria before. And so we're taking an area that is basically right now just cool season grasses that we've allowed to grow, and we maybe only mow it once a year. There's not a whole lot of, really, there's no nectar producing or pollen producing, insect pollen producing plants in that area. So we're going to take those old grasses out and install prairie by seed. So Donovan Park is one of the sites we're working on. Robinson Park is another site. Robinson Park has probably the most consistent rusty patch bumblebee sightings that we've seen. And the place that we see them is in this little area that's surrounded by yellow here. There's a little prairie planting right here where the pointer is that Susie Barber about 15 years ago or 20 years ago helped us plant. It's just a little postage stamp of a prairie, but we can consistently see rusty patch bumblebee there. But they have really, the population has been, you know, very scattered, very small. Right over here in this region of Robinson Park is a nice glacial drift hill prairie that has a ton of nectar producing species, but for some reason the rusty patch bumblebees seem not to be able to get through this woods to get there. And that's not uncommon. This woods here was infested, or is infested with bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, which to a bumblebee basically is like a brick wall. They have a hard time getting through that thick undergrowth of bush honeysuckle. So just this last week, as a matter of fact, we used our habitat funding, Davy Resource Service from Elmhurst, Illinois. We had a crew here that basically worked in removing the bush honeysuckle from this area. So next year, we're hoping it will be possible for the rusty patch bumblebee that used the little planting here to actually make it over and find this hill prairie. And the other thing this grant will do is allow us to expand this little postage stamp, which is up on this corner, along this roadside, to expand the prairie up the roadside and along a couple little lobes of hills that stick out in this direction. So, so we'll be doing the timber stand improvement area is done here. The other thing that this will do is allow for increasing populations of spring ephemeral plants. There's we do have a few Virginia bluebells and stuff in there that had kind of gotten overshaded by the bush honeysuckle. And so hopefully we can get some more of those spring ephemeral plants to provide some good spring flowers for these bees.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
What side of the road are we looking at? The purple and that small postage stamp. What sides of?
Yeah.
Of that's.
So this is Mossville Road right here.
Right.
Okay. Right. North is up. So
okay.
So there's a parking lot. There's a parking lot right here. You can see my pointer.
Yep.
And there's actually a trail that leads all the way back through this. So there's a little gravel path that basically comes off of, there's two paths that come off of this parking lot.
So don't take it out.
And so the one gravel path will take you right through this site.
Okay, thank you.
There is another, there's actually, there's kind of three parking lots at Robinson Park. One is here on the south side of the road. The other is straight across from it. And then finally, there's another little parking lot right down here next to the Prairie postage stamp, so to speak.
Yeah.
All right. So, so Robinson Park is, that project is currently underway. And the last of the three areas we're working is Detweiller Riverside. And Detweiller is kind of, this is an interesting one. This is one we've actually got two grants going on at the same time. And we have the Habitat grant, which is working this area all along here. That's kind of, the color is hard to see on here. It's kind of surrounded by orange in this region. So this heavy red line is the flood zone, the 26-foot flood zone. When the Illinois River reaches 26 feet, which it does on a fairly regular occasion anymore, this much of the golf course was flooded every year. So this is one reason it's no longer a golf course. It is now you know, we're bringing back the habitat into this area. So the other thing we have is a NAWCA grant to work in this woodland, which is along right along the flood zone of the Illinois River. And this is the area that was always kind of a habitat area. It gets flooded very frequently. So it was always kind of left to be a woodland. We're going to take out some of the invasive species that have, there's some hybrid maples that have kind of invaded that woodlands. They're hybridized from red maples and silver maples that were growing on the golf course that have now become an invasive species. And we're getting a grant to take some of those and to help promote floodplain prairie along there. So we got two grants working in Detweiller Riverside. And, you know, of all the areas that we're working, you know, I think that this one really entices me because we have an opportunity here. This is Route 29 that basically comes north and south here along the Illinois River. Detweiller Park, of course, the normal Detweiller Park, the soccer fields and whatnot are over here. The woods are up here. But there's very few places where we have kind of a region where we can kind of restore the flood pulse of the Illinois River, the habitats that would be found within this zone. In so many places, just like the golf course that's here. You know, the river was hemmed off, and when the river would flood, after the river, what would we do? We'd basically come in and clean up all the flood debris, or, you know, and start mowing again. So we have an opportunity here of taking it, you know, above the flood zone and really getting a good cross section of habitats from above flood zone down to, you know, emergent. So, you know, we can in just that one area, we can restore, you know, wet emergent vegetation. We can restore sedge meadow, wet prairie, wet sand prairie, you know, floodplain forest, marsh, and shrub swamp can all be put back into that former golf course footprint. So it's got a unique opportunity to restore quite a bit of area. So what are the steps of this process? You know, the restoration across all of these three projects kind of involve these practices. One, we're removing exotic invasive species. And since most of these areas were at one point or another turf, we need to reduce cool season grasses. Flooding is helping us do that at Detweiller. But in the other areas, such as Donovan Park, we're going to have to resort to using a chemical that I mentioned earlier, glyphosate or Roundup, to get rid of some of those cool season grasses so that we can get warm season grasses back and native prairie back in the mix. Once we reduce the cool season grasses, we basically do some rough disking that enhances the Boltonia decurrens, that decurrent false aster, which we have growing already along in Detweiller, and also improves seed to soil contact of all of the seed that we are putting in any of the sites. We use prescribed burns to reduce the duff layers of these cool season grasses. Woodland restorations for rusty patch bumblebee shelter and spring ephemeral nectar producers. We're going to overseed with appropriate mixes for the habitat. We can get sedge meadow mix for the areas that are moister. Sand prairie, dry sand prairie for those areas that do get a lot of drier soils in the summertime. We're using seed from Pheasants Forever. The Habitat store, if you're looking for prairie seed, they have some of the best prices on mixes out there. So we're also going to monitor that germination success over the next few years, decide what's working, where do we have to go back in and augment seed. We also have to continue to monitor for exotic invasive species. There's a lot of these old golf courses, once they're let go, they tend to really grow a great crop of Canada thistle and some other nasty things. So we have to continually monitor for those. And then we'll do follow-up management that will include periodic prescribed burns to keep these areas open in an open state or an open grassland mixed state. And of course, volunteer stewardship is something that's important. We talk about some of the things that we do with volunteers in the Park District are things such as monitoring invasive species for removal. We also monitor endangered and threatened species like our rusty patch bumblebee or our monarch butterflies. We do prescribed burns, bird counts, butterfly counts, workshops and training, seed collections, plant propagation. We do a lot of these things through different volunteer programs we have in our parks. And so, hey, look at this. Who is that there? Pete Fenner, I see, and Maureen Amico, and some youngsters from ICC. So, it's not just the Park District that does this, but the Peoria Audubon has volunteer work days as well on some of the property that they own and manage. This was, I can't remember if it was last year or year before at Oak Bluff. So, so it's, definitely, these parks will continue to involve people. One of the things that Peoria Audubon's doing at Detweiller Riverside is, and I know Pete and Maury and Rick Fox, and who else has been involved with that, Pete? Probably Dennis Endicott too. They've all gone out and done, had a good E-Bird list for that site. I think 160 species now, unless somebody added something today. So
yeah, Dennis has been involved in both Hartzlers and others, even some folks from Bloomington have come over.
Yeah. So yeah, 160 species, and they, you know, that's kind of been just this last half of the year here. So we still got more that we can. I think it's like the #3 hotspot in Peoria County now. So it's quite a bit going on out there. So you can find the eBird list. Just look at, it's called Detweiller Park Peoria Boat Ramp is the way it shows up on eBird. So I just want to give a shout out to the project funders who have been involved with funding this project. Illinois Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Illinois Farm Bureau, Pheasants and Forever, especially the Illinois chapter, and then Peoria Wilds have all put funding towards this project. So we appreciate our partners. And with that, I think that is my last slide. So I will end that and be happy to answer any questions that people have. You can unmute yourself and ask any questions.
Everybody can temporarily unmute themselves just by simply holding down the space bar while they're unmuted, and then they can talk, or just feel free to unmute yourself completely.
So, Mike, I'm interested in knowing any particular different trails or structures or anything will be built or created for travel, birding, for the public to enjoy those spots.
So right now, these grants and funding sources we have don't have funding for any access, I would say, at this point. We do have at Detweiller Riverside, there is a mowed path kind of through the area that we're working. But right now, and then at Robinson Park, like I said, there are paths already in existence there. And at Donovan Park, you've got the bicycle path that borders the hypotenuse of the triangle, and then you have actually a trail that runs from SIDS over towards Keller Station. So there's a trail that does go through that. So, but these grants in particular don't have funding for access amenities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. We were moving a big log the other day, and a bumblebee was in between these two logs. Was it dying, or did we just ruin his habitat by taking it?
Well, it could was, if this was fairly recently, it could have been a queen, that had come out of a hive to find. Oftentimes, you'll find them under logs and in rotting wood, burrowed down in the ground. So it could be, most of the time the workers tend not to try to seek cover. They know their life is over, and so they just kind of lay out and die. But they're rode hard and put away wet, But the queens, the ones that are actually seeking cover, that's probably a queen. Okay.
Anybody else have any other questions or comments? Speak up.
Mike, is there going to be any interpretive signage with these projects?
Well, I think we definitely want interpretive signage on them. We're going to have to find different funding sources. And that's one of the things we'll probably work with, like Peoria Wilds, to get from or the Peoria Park District Foundation, to seek funding through like Illinois Clean Energy or some of the other programs that would pay for some interpretive signage. And kind of like that, and that's what we did like at Tawny Oaks when we did the Prairie Path, the interpretive signage that's there. And so we'll, as we get these things and kind of get the habitat down, I think, I think the access ideas and the trail interpretive wayside exhibits will follow.
So Mike, how extensive have the population studies been for this rusty patch bumblebee? It just seems like there's habitat across the river in Tazewell or Woodford County that species might exist, but
Yeah.
it doesn't look like it from your charts. So
Yeah.
has that been studied, or has that just not really been studied much?
It's when most of there's very little funding out there to do population studies, and we wouldn't have known that the rusty patch bumblebee was in Peoria County unless somebody found them. So could they be in Tazewell County? They could. It's just perhaps nobody's found them yet. So just like that's kind of where the citizen science, pre-COVID, last year and the year before, we had 2 rusty patch bumblebee workshops that U.S. Fish and Wildlife put on, and so the whole idea is to get people out looking for these things. Now, unfortunately, there's been kind of, I wouldn't say any blowback, but sometimes people don't necessarily want to find an endangered species. What does that mean to me if I find an endangered species on my, habitat plot? And so that's kind of the double-edged sword of being an endangered species. You've got a lot of people that want to find you and a lot of people that don't want to find you. And if you want to be found, you better hope one finds you over the other. So yeah,
should I use Seek then to, that Seek app to identify it and report it if I ever were to see one?
Yeah, if you are, there is actual sighting forms that can be used. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a monitoring protocol established for rusty patch bumblebees, and so that's been something that they've been promoting. Really, we're kind of just at the beginning phase of trying to get some citizen science projects going so that people can actually be out looking for these things. And that the habitat requirements they have aren't really anything unique. I mean, prairie plantings are everywhere, I think. And so I think it's a species that if we get more people monitoring for it, maybe we can get it off the endangered species list, and take away some of the stigma that being an endangered species can have. So we just got to get people trained and out looking for them.
Okay, thanks.
Trying to get a little bit of a wild spot, and that Canadian thistle is just coming in as aggressively as the asters and the goldenrod. What can we do other than hand dig it?
So yeah, Canada thistle is tough, and we've been using a mix of a herbicide. We're using Garlon 3A, which is basically a broadleafed type herbicide, and mixing that with Milestone, which seems to be particularly useful against thistles and spot treating areas where we have it. Those are now you come from the agricultural community, so you probably, you can usually get those through farm services. But Milestone and Garland 3A or Tahoe 3A, a mixture of those two things, and the label instructions, tell how to treat, what percentages will treat for Canada thistle. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions about everything? I noticed in your talk that you indicated that you had drawn a 26-foot level at your Detweiller Riverside. I noticed that this past season, I think it got up to about 28 feet.
Yep.
So
Mm-hmm.
how much more flooding did it do to the site when it reached that 28-foot level?
Well, it basically, it probably took up about another 10%, 10 to 12% of the area that was formerly the golf course there. So that area kind of comes up in level. I wouldn't say steeply, but 3 feet can makes a lot of difference.
Yeah. Are there any plans for doing anything about the existing buildings that are there?
Not right now. One of the that clubhouse, there is a clubhouse there. The restroom that used to be down by there was a restroom by the marina. That's now gone. That was taken out, and there is still part of a parking lot down there by the marina itself is not really useful because we'd have to dredge a mile of river bottom to make it to the channel. You could walk out to the channel from there. It's so silted in. But yeah, there's not a plan yet for the clubhouse. Part of the problem of that site, you wouldn't think the lack of water would be part of a problem, but the wells that feed that clubhouse are all defunct. They're all and would need to be modernized and replaced.
In other words?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but I think probably the Park District will put out a kind of request for proposals at some point for the clubhouse to see if a public-private partnership could form, kind of like it did with SIDS. I doubt you'd have a restaurant down there. It seems like restaurants around on Route 29 just don't survive no matter what restaurants they are. But there might be another use for that building. Okay.
Any other comments, questions?
Thank you very much, Mike.
Well, thank you, everyone. I sure appreciate your time. And this is, I think I've done talks on Zoom before, but you're my guinea pigs. This is my first PowerPoint on Zoom. It was kind of discerning because I couldn't see anybody, and I didn't know if my computer is frozen and I was talking to no one. So, so it's a new experience, but thanks for the opportunity.
You did very well, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really good presentation.
Take care.
Thanks. All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mike.
Now, I think you did a great job. You had a couple comments in the chat that said Zoom is bizarre, but it worked really well. I think you did a good job, considering all the pressure you're under.
Yeah. Well, you made it easy. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and sign off and